Welcome everybody to the Filling the Gaps. This is number 8 on soul and spirit. So the topic we're going to discuss today is whether or not in human beings there's only body or whether or not there's body and soul. Of the human being that's not bodily, not just material. Okay, the basis for talking about this is to look at activities that human beings carry out and to ask whether or not these activities can be fully explained by bodily dimension of man alone, or whether you have to posit or recognize the existence of another spiritual dimension, what we would call a soul. So to start, it might be interesting just to look at a few of these activities. These are activities of the mind, we will call them, and it's worth paying a little attention to them. We normally don't think about them too much, but let's just take something like memory. So memory is interesting. It's distinct from sensation, where you're looking at seeing something that's actually present now. Distinct even from imagination, where you're able to visualize or hear things that are not actually present, not actually even in existence. We can imagine purple mountains and dragons, things like that. But memory is interesting in that when you remember, you're remembering something, one that you experienced in the past. Okay? And memory is always of that, something in the past, something that you yourself have experienced. I cannot remember George Washington crossing the Delaware River just because I wasn't there. Okay, but I can remember being in kindergarten because I was there. Now, the interesting thing about memory, if you start thinking about it, is that it's always of the past. You can't remember what's in the future. You can't remember what's in the present. You always remember what's in the past. But the past, by definition, does not exist. If it did exist, it'd be present. Just like the future does not exist. The future will exist, but precisely because it's future, it doesn't exist now. And so things in the past are by definition things that no longer exist. So our memories are memories of things that don't exist. But that's curious when you think about it. It means that somehow I have present to me in my mind something that no longer exists. You ask, how could that be? How can what no longer exists somehow be present to me? And that's what we call memory. But this memory is actually kind of in some ways an amazing thing when you think about it, that you can somehow keep present that which no longer is. Okay? Another activity that we engage in all the time with our mind is to deal with abstract concepts. So just take something like cat. If I said cat, everybody, you would all understand what I mean. But if I say, what is the size of cat? What is the color of cat? What is the weight of cat? Well, cat doesn't have any particular size. Cats come in a lot of different sizes, and they're all cats. It doesn't have any particular color. You have black cats, white cats, striped cats, Siamese cats, all different colors. So cat itself doesn't have any particular color or the weight of cat. Okay, every individual cat will have a specific weight. But cat itself doesn't have any specific weight. So when you start thinking about the concept cat, you realize this is not even something we imagine. If you imagine a cat, that cat's going to have a certain size, a certain color, be in a certain position, and yet the concept cat doesn't have any of those. Okay, so these are interesting things. The cat, we use these abstract concepts, we actually are using them all the time. We say, I don't like cats. Do you have a cat? What color is your cat? But we do this with many other things, like everything actually. Doors, cars, boats, mountains, snowstorms, whatever you want to say. We use actually these abstract terms in all the time. And in fact, we would not actually even be able to speak without these abstract terms. Just think of that if every door had its own name. It'd be very difficult to talk to somebody about closing the door, open the door, if you had to have a different name for every single door. But with an abstract concept, you can have door, and you say that door, this door, close the door, close the car door, and so on. Or same thing with cars. Just imagine telling a little kid, tell them, well, watch the cars when you cross the street. But if you didn't have a concept of car, then you'd have to say, you'd have a string of 500 different names for all the individual cars that might come by while he's crossing the street. That would not work so well. So we have these abstract concepts. Now the interesting question is, one, how do we get them? And how do we explain how we operate with them, or where are they, if you want to put it in those minds? So these are the sorts of things that we're talking about when we say that we have the mind. Okay, activities that we carry out with our mind, and that's imagination, sensing, thinking, and as we'll see, things like willing, choosing, and so on. Now, there's a rather prevalent view of the human being which says that the mind is essentially just the body, part of the body, specifically the brain. Okay? And we can call this the psychophysical identity thesis. The psychophysical identical thesis, where psycho is reference for mind, physical would be the brain. So according to the psychophysical identity thesis, the mind, that by which we think, is the brain and nothing but the brain. Okay. So all these activities I'm talking about are in fact activities of the brain. Okay. There isn't anything else. As I say, this is a very standard view. It's a view that you will run into quite often in school or just standard literature and things. Right. Now, this view is generally based on materialism, or reductive materialism, which says that everything that exists is matter or combinations of matter, and all attributes of things are material attributes of one kind or another, the sort that you would study in science, especially in biology, chemistry, and physics. We've talked about this before. So in this framework, if you take the identity of the brain with the mind and you say that the mind is nothing but the brain, okay, we have to look at that and ask, what exactly happens in the brain. So here's a picture of our brain. We'll use this and that pink stuff in there is the brain, okay? And if you ask, what is the brain? Well, the brain is living tissue, and like all other living tissue, it's made of cells. Cells in the brain get a specific name. They're called neurons, and they have a specific structure different from other cells. And I have a picture here of the neurons. So the neurons, this is the cell, the neuron here, but it has these like little arms coming out. Okay, one big one called the axon, smaller one called dendrites. Okay, and in your brain, you've got about 100 billion neurons. Okay, quite a few of them. Of course, that number's not very big now that the federal government is giving away trillions of dollars. Nevertheless, it's a big number. And what happens in the brain is that these neurons, these little dendrites and these axons, are very close to each other. And when something happens in the brain, electrical charge goes down them. And if you see this little picture in the corner here, there's a little gap between this axon, okay, and the other neuron. And when the electrical charge builds up, almost like an electrical charge jumps across. It's almost like a spark plug, if you know about spark plugs, how they work in cars. And now that gap is called a synapse, and they speak of the synapse as firing, okay, that there's this electrical activity that occurs in the brain. Okay? So when people talk about brain activity, actually this is what they're talking about. They're talking about this electrical activity, this transfer of electrical charge. And the way they study this is actually they put a little electrode into your brain. It's actually like a little voltmeter. And then when you engage in certain activities, for example, you smell something, they see what part of the brain has increased electrical activity, and then they say, okay, that's the part of the brain where you smell. And then if you remember things, another part of the brain has more electrical activity, then okay, that's the part of the brain where you are smelling. And the same thing for remembering, and so on and so forth. Okay? So it's important to realize that this is what, when people talk about brain activity, what we actually can measure with, in terms of brain activity, it's this. It's the electrical activity of these neurons, all right? Now, the question then comes, is this adequate to explain our actual experience of things? I want to look at a number of things that it's not easy to explain. In fact, they don't get explained with this, what we call an explanation. And the point of there is to see the inadequacy of this understanding of the mind, that is just the brain. Okay? So the first big problem with this understanding is that when you start analyzing it and you say, well, what you're really getting when you look at the brain is electrical activity, you ask, okay, but my own experience is of things like sounds, colors, tastes, smells. So you take an orange, I look at the orange, I see orange. Okay, I smell a smell. If I taste it, I taste a taste. Now, according to this psychophysical identity thesis, that activity in your brain is all there is. But then you say, all right, but these electrical impulses, do they have any color? I don't believe anybody attributes color to electrical impulses. They're just charges. Do they have a smell? Okay, do they have a taste? Okay. So you ask the question, okay, if this is the analysis of what is going on, where does the taste come in? Where does the smell come in? Where does the color come in? I don't know if, in other words, you haven't really explained the very experience that you're trying to explain, namely my experience of color, sound, smell, and taste. All right? And this has been a big problem ever since people have tried to explain what we do with our minds just in terms of physical activities, namely the brain. Okay? What they describe, namely the electrical impulses, simply are not the same as colors, sounds, and so on. Sometimes they'll say, oh, well, when you have the certain firing of the neurons, then you see orange. You say, okay, that's fine, but are you saying then that the seeing of the orange is distinct from the firing of the neurons? If so, then they're not identical. Okay, and so much for the identity thesis. Okay, but this is actually usually what happens. People say when the neurons fire, that's when you see. But if you just take that on its face value, that means you have two distinct things. The actual awareness, conscious experience of the color or the taste or the sound is distinct from this firing of the neurons. So if you stick only with the firing of the neurons, you end up losing the very experience you're trying to explain. So that's the first big point. I have a book here, this called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, by Thomas Nagel, atheist philosopher, but very interesting one. And he points out at some length this problem, basically saying that the materialist Darwinian theory of evolution simply cannot deal with consciousness, can't explain how such a thing would ever arise because it can't explain the thing at all in the first place, basically because of materialism. So that's the first big problem. Second big issue is if you ask who is aware, you say, okay, I'm aware of the color, the smell, the taste, but where is this I? Okay, is there, is like one of the neurons supposedly the I, and that neuron's aware of everything else? I don't think anybody really thinks the neurons are aware of anything. But this is an issue. I'm the one who experiences these things. Okay? And it seems like the I is somehow apart from, over and above, whatever you want to call it, this flow of smells, colors, shapes. I mean, I'm aware of the color, I'm aware of the taste, I taste, so it's very hard to figure out where this I is in the brain. Okay? If it's not one, you could say, well, it's one portion of the brain, you could try that, but then you have the same problem in there. So where's the I in that? So it's actually here interesting. There was a man, a doctor named Wilder Penfield, who wrote a book, 1975, called The Mystery of the Mind. So he was a neurosurgeon who did many surgeries, I think some groundbreaking surgeries on the brain, and to help eliminate epileptic seizures. So he would actually apply electrodes to the brain to patients who are conscious. It doesn't hurt because your brain doesn't have the nerves to feel the pain. Okay. But one of the things he discovered is that when he put these electrodes in and then applied a little electrical charge, he could actually stimulate the brain. He could make people remember things, make them move their limbs, make them see things that weren't really there, all kinds of things. But he discovered that what he could not do is make the people actually believe these things. Okay? Right? They would always say, you did that. They knew that they had not done that. And they'd say, that's something you did to me. Right? So somehow the I, always stood aloof from all the stuff he was doing. He came to the conclusion that the I, the kind of this personal I that's involved here, is simply not part of the brain neuronal complex. It's something aloof from that, something distinct from that, and that you can't reduce the I to just the neurons in the brain. Okay. A third issue that's worth, I'll say very quickly, is just the fact that we are aware of the past as past, which I just talked about. If you think about the psychophysical identity thesis, you realize that everything in the brain is in the present. What's there is there, and what's there right now is there. And what might have been there but no longer is there simply is not there. So nothing in the brain is past, it's just present, it's just what is. And then you say, well, how is it possible then that I would experience the past as past? Okay. Now you may say, well, there's a certain pattern of neurons, and when they fire, then you remember your kindergarten class. Okay, but then we're back to the same issue we had earlier. My memory of the kindergarten class is not identical with the firing of the neurons. Okay, you could say that when the neurons fire, I remember. That's perfectly fine. It's just that you're making a duality between the neurons firing and the memory of the kindergarten class. Okay, another issue here that we run into is that of the abstract concepts. Same problem here. It's very difficult to figure out how you would get an abstract concept if you have this identity, because what you're going to get is always an individual firing of the neurons. Okay? Every experience you have, whether it's of an orange or a tree or a sound, color, shape, all these things come into the brain and you have a certain firing of the neurons. Okay? But if you start analyzing, you say, well, how could you ever get something like cat? You never see cat. You see this cat, you see that cat, you say this colored cat, this size cat, this cat in this posture. Okay? You never actually experience this cat. And yet we have this concept of cat. And so you say, well, where does that come from? And if you analyze that, you realize it's pretty much impossible to figure out how such a thing could happen if you're just working with neurons that are firing. Okay. Another issue, this is a very important issue, it has to do with free will. So I think we all experience that we have free will. We make choices. We're responsible for our actions. Okay, we have this very profound sense that when we do something, we could have done something else. Okay, instead of watching this video, you could be playing video games. I think we're all aware of that. And we also treat other people that way all the time. We treat them as if they're free agents who have control over their actions, so that when they do X, something bad, we get mad at them. We say that was a bad thing to do. Why did he do that? assuming that they could have not done that they did it because they chose to do it. In other words, because they were free. So many aspects of human life presuppose this freedom. Okay. The fact that we punish people, we we praise people, we blame people, and so on and so forth. We get indignant with them and things. Okay. Now, the psychophysical identity thesis really ends up denying free will. Why is that? Because if everything that we do is a matter of the brain, and if the brain is purely material, then the brain and everything in the brain will simply follow the laws of nature. And that means that every last bit of the brain and the brain together will always do what it does because it has to follow the laws of nature. That means that when we do whatever we do or think whatever we think, we could not do anything but that. Okay, we're determined, as they say, by the laws of nature. Okay. So if you say that all you have is the brain, that there's nothing, the mind is not anything distinct from the brain, you end up denying free will. Now this has huge implications for life, and we really couldn't live life the way we live it now. And there's a famous neuroscientist named John Eccles who basically says, when he's talking about this, that rather than deny free will, which is an obvious experiential part of life, he says we should question our theory and say, okay, there's something deficient about this theory if it ends up denying something that's obviously true. Okay? Beyond that, you have the problem that if you really accept this thesis, you will end up undermining the very truth claims of science itself. Okay? Because you end up saying all claims that made by scientists are, they make those because that's what their brain, so to speak, made them do. Okay? So the scientist says free-falling bodies on the surface of the earth accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared. And you say, well, I guess your brain made you say that. Okay. Some other one says 9.5 meters per second squared. Well, his brain made him say that. And all these truths that you think you've proven by science, you really just say, oh, your brain made you say that. And maybe somebody else's brain would make him say something else. Okay. So unless you accept that there's such a thing as free will, that you can actually do experiments, you can actually examine evidence, and you can then come to a conclusion based on that evidence, okay, you don't have science. Okay. So actually, this view, in the end, even undermines the science on which it seems to think that it's based. Okay, so if this is the problem then with the physical identity thesis, okay, if we say that you really can't explain certain human experiences, very basic ones and very, very important ones, thinking, remembering, and so on and so forth, then you have to say that you need another explanation here. You have to say there's something here more than just the body. There's a mind, and the mind is not identical with the body, and that means the mind has to be ultimately something immaterial, what we call spirit or spiritual. Okay? By spiritual means something that exists but not materially. All right? So what we have to say is that the human being, you have to explain the human being as being a combination of body and soul. Okay? Body's obvious that we have a body, but that there's more than a body there. There's something else by which we're able to engage in these activities that we engage in all the time. Okay? And we use the term soul for that. So of course, if the soul's not material, well, let me just say that the soul, then you'd say, how do we explain the fact that we can think? Because we have a soul. How do we explain the fact that we can will? We have free will, not determined by material causes, because we have a soul, okay, that we're spiritual. This has certain implications. I'll just go through very quickly here. One is, where does this soul come from? So normally we'd think that material things can only produce material things. So if you have an immaterial soul, you have to say where that comes from. Okay, the traditional teaching of Catholic teaching is that each soul is infused directly by God into the body. Okay? And then similarly at death, the question then comes, okay, if at death, when the body decays, what happens to the soul? And this is the basis for talking about the immortality of the soul, that because the soul is not material, but is spiritual, it can continue to exist after the body decays, which happens at death. Okay. Well, that's a quick summary of the class. I wish we had more time to do the full 2-hour class. I'm sorry I had to go so quickly through this. I hope everybody's doing well, and hope to see you soon, and we can get back out and actually have our normal classes again.